Hey everyone, and welcome to chapter 23. We're going to wrap up the book by talking about research proposals and a little bit about that process. And as part of this class, you're going to read the first few chapters of the APA manual. So we'll cover some of the highlights in that. So Rubin and Babbie talk about writing up research proposals and kind of what that plan looks like. And it's going to vary a little bit. For some of you, you may never do any formal research where you need maybe grant funding, but you need to be able to articulate the evaluation process you're going to use because a lot of the same information is in the IRB process. So remember, we talked about institutional review boards. And so whether you're writing a research proposal or a grant funding proposal, or you're just going to do a study as a researcher and you want to be able to fill out the IRB form, you've got to know this information. And so Rubin and Babbie highlight a few things. They talk about different types of funding sources. The National Institute of Health website has a lot of good information. There's government sources. Sometimes there's a large trust that's out there that wants to look at social issues. And so there are different types of funding sources. The Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA, also does a huge amount of grants, especially looking at different things like substance use or gerontology. So there's a lot of different grant sources that we have, and sometimes you apply for them on your own. Sometimes these are large, institutional, through university or through an organization, but there are definitely different ways that you can get funding to be able to help you with your study. And there's a lot of different elements. Things like Qualtrics or SPSS, all of those cost money, and so sometimes grants can cover that. If you need to travel, let's say to do program evaluation in 7 places around the state, it can help with that sometimes depending on the grant. And so it's really nice to have funding. It can help individuals be able to do the research more effectively with good tools. So a lot of different ways that you can come up with funding. You can always Google and look around if you're interested. Also, the book talks a little bit about the difference between research grants versus contracts. So finally, they talk a little bit about grant preparation. If you do any sort of grant writing as a social worker, it takes some preparation. It's time consuming and they often have complicated forms. And so because of that, you want to be really prepared. No one can just throw up a grant easily, right? Typically, you are going to, whether it's writing a grant for services at your agency or writing like a research grant, you really want to learn about the grant expectations. Some grants even have requirements about they have to have a certain type of degree or a certain level of degree or a certain number of people or a certain amount of money. So you really want to learn about what are the grant expectations. You also want to see if there's some sort of a liaison or contact person. Rubin and Babbie say making that connection is really helpful and to be able to maybe have someone you can ask questions of. They also suggest reviewing previously approved proposals as well. This is really helpful to see what type of grants are being approved. What are the topics that are interesting right now? And does your topic or your evaluation fall into line with that? Does it meet their requirements? So it's really important to kind of do a lot of research before you jump into that grant writing process right at the beginning. A lot of grants also have some sort of webinar that they'll ask you to attend where they'll give you good information. Here's our grant. Here's what we're looking for. Here's the requirements, so that you don't write up this huge, wonderful proposal and then they're like, oh, you didn't have this, so you can't do the grant. So Rubin and Babbie give you some really good tips and tools for that. They also talk about some of the elements that you have, things like cover materials. This may or may not include an executive summary. Executive summaries are pretty common in that sometimes you're handing over grant reports or anything that's very large, let's say hundreds of pages. So an executive summary can be a really nice way to do a quick overview. You'll see this a lot with large national research projects. They'll say, in this, here are the key highlights of what we found, just so that you have an idea of what the report was before you dive into hundreds and hundreds of pages. So sometimes they'll require an executive summary, sometimes they won't. Rubin and Babbie talk about sometimes they want a longer, sometimes it's 1 page. You also want to make sure you're really clear about what are the problems and what are the objectives. So if you're going to go in, whether it's an IRB approval or you're looking for a grant, they're going to want to say, what is the problem? You have to be very clear about here's the issue, here's why it's important, here's what the objectives are, and here's how I want to get to them. You're also going to do some sort of literature review as well. You might study how many other people have looked at this problem. Why is this problem an issue? Is it because it's becoming really common? Is there a funding source resource or law that's about to change. So you'll do a literature review to see what's already out there, what's been done, and what are kind of the themes, what needs to be studied still. Finally, you'll want to make sure that obviously you have a very well proposed plan. This is where all that work we've done learning about quantitative versus qualitative versus mixed methods. Is it exploratory? Is it explanatory? What is the research design we're going to use? This is where that all really comes together, and you say, here's what I'm wanting to study, here are the problems and objectives, here's the literature review, what's already out there and what needs to be done, and here's my plan. And making sure it's well written and formatted is critical. I've written small grants and I've been part of larger grants, and what I find is all of this stuff that sometimes you're like, oh, why does my teacher care so much if it's cited correctly? This is where it becomes really, really important, because you're probably up against other organizations that also have really cool proposals. So making sure that your proposal is clear, it's well written, it's formatted, it's well thought out, that can really be helpful for you in this process. So that is chapter 23. It's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of good information in there. As part of this class, I also ask you to read chapters 1 and 2 as part of the APA manual. And so the APA manual, we're all pretty familiar with it. In my class, and those of my students, you know that I've got my APA resources and videos that I've created, but that's typically the focus on things like citations and references pages. The APA manual, though, has lots of cool stuff in it. For example, chapter 1 has a really, really good overview of all the different types of articles that we just talked about. Quantitative versus qualitative versus mixed methods versus case study, literature review articles, theoretical articles, and student papers. So it gives you a really nice overview of kind of differentiating between the different types. And so that could be helpful if you're doing your literature review and you're like, I don't exactly know what kind of article this is. You can look in chapter 1. They also have some information about the importance of ethical compliancy and accuracy when we're researching our data, reporting our data, publishing our data. It talks a little bit about handling data during the review and after publication. Once our data is collected, we don't just delete everything and say, woo, we're done. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we're not holding on to very sensitive information. And so there's some good information about how do we hold on to it in case there's questions later, but it's still a way that really maintains the anonymity or confidentiality that you talked about when you did the study. There's also some information about duplicating work. It does talk about self-plagiarism. That's kind of a newer thing in the 7th edition. But basically the idea is you can't write one paper and submit it to 4 different classes. That's considered plagiarizing yourself. And so when you have a really good paper, let's say you wrote a great paper and you want to share some of it in a new paper, you still have to cite yourself and say, oh, I'd say Cobb 2020, and I would have to make sure that everything was cited formally. And so you really want to make sure that you're not just cutting and pasting older stuff and trying to create new papers. You want to make sure that you've got new material, and if you're using anything that you've written before, you got to paraphrase it and you have to include it as well as a reference. And then finally, it talks a little bit about protecting the rights and welfare of research participants and subjects, stuff we've talked about in the book and in your city training. It really summarizes it nicely, and it highlights some of the different types of conflict of interest, things like author conflict of interest or editor and reviewer conflict of interest. So chapter 1 has a really nice overview, in a lot of ways ties together a lot of the different concepts we've talked about in this class. Finally, I'm going to have you look over chapter 2, which are different paper elements. This is what my quick guide is based on. It talks about title page, how do you structure things like where do the numbers go for the pages, the overall format. It also talks a little bit about organizing in different heading levels. The organization starts on page 47, and sometimes knowing how to format the headings, like do I bold it? Is it aligned to the left? Do I italicize bold it? That can be really challenging for students, and they made some changes between the 6th and the 7th edition. So I always recommend having that as a well-worn section of your manual to make sure you are putting the correct heading levels and formatting. Finally, the book does a really nice job in chapter 2. They have a great sample student paper, and it shows you everything from tables to formatting, and it guides you through the process. And so it's a great resource. Sometimes with the APA guide, students kind of buy it and it sits under a stack of books somewhere. But if you do a lot of writing, like most of us, I have mine sitting on my desk, easily accessible, so if I have any questions about formatting or funky citations or anything like that. So you'll read chapters 1 and 2 as well, and hopefully this gives you a nice structure as you are formatting your final literature review paper and moving forward in your academic process. So there are my references. Thank you so much for sitting with me. There were a lot of videos and a lot of information this semester. I hope it was helpful. Thanks.